So what we've shown you here is kind of the range of metrics that are in development, various applications. We wanted to give you some examples so that you'd have an idea of what these look like. See if I can stand over here where I can see most everyone. What these look like and what some of the applications for them are. So now what we want to do is hear from you in terms of your questions. We can have a very lively discussion, but I already see hands, so we'll start here. And you state your name and where you're from and your question.
I wanted to ask specifically about all metrics, not article level metrics. Do you think that these will only really have any value once you can impart some vector or higher order of quantity to them? Because looking at Twitter, for example, the paper I know that was tweeted most was the Ask Me Live paper, and all those tweets said it's a pile of crap, this paper. So, so that is in no way a measure of quality. In fact, it's almost like they're kind of like that's a negative attribute. And I don't know. I don't know if the same thing would happen on Facebook, but you can imagine going forward there might be ways in which you could build in kind of like vector quality to it rather than just simple links.
Yeah, who wants it?
You were just talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, 2 points. One is citations have similar issues, right? Negative citations.
They're not nearly as strong as tweeting.
The other thing that you have is it's not just Twitter counts, right? So when you're categorizing things and you're noticing there's a lot of social media activity, but no one's bookmarking this. No one's putting it in their reference managers. No one's doing that. You're seeing, again, like that one visualization I had up where activity's high in one area and nothing else anywhere else. So even without quantifying it, you can compare it to other groups of papers and see the outliers. And usually if something's only getting tweeted and nothing else, well, that's not going to be, it is what it is.
So with alt metrics, you're actually looking at a correlation of data points that put together a picture. Yeah.
The other thing is, I think it certainly is interesting to see negative citations in many media in lots of ways, right? I think, for instance, there's been a sort of in the bibliometric community, there's a lot of folks have a lot of examples of books or papers that were highly cited in negative ways, but that wasn't necessarily a liability. That it was thought, well, a lot of people didn't like this, but it really actually promoted the development of the field because it was wrong in an interesting way. And I think it's one of those things where the opposite of good science isn't wrong science. The opposite of good science is boring science in many ways. Science that finds something trivial or unimportant or not meaningful. Science that's wrong in an interesting way does move scientific discourse forward. Now, it's hard to be wrong in an interesting way, right? It's easy to be wrong in a trivial way. But if you can be wrong in an interesting way, I think that sometimes is worth noting as well.
Just one other comment, because you and I did some research on this a year and a half ago, classifying 500 tweets by what's the sentiment. So is this a positive link, this is a great paper, or is this the opposite, or is it just neutral? And we found that there was a very, very small percentage of negative tweets, and I think that's probably still true. So I think high numbers of tweets usually is just lots of activity, which is more attention, it's more alerting, oh, here is this link. And I think this example used is just too extreme. So, and if you look at what's top tweeted on PLOS, I mean, you can just look at the titles and you know why. And the top tweeted paper right now is, of course, using social media as sort of a guide for scientists to read. That's, of course, top tweeted.
All right, William, you had your hand up.
It's very much a problem. I think all metrics are additional dimensions.
No, but I just meant in both cases, and Martin's point is right, is whether you envisage a future in which that kind of analysis you could do, that you've done, you could do dynamically and incorporate that into your metrics or kind of like trajectory that you're describing, so that you would know that this characteristic signature of your metric in time indicated that this was really a valuable paper or not.
Did you hear it?
No, I thought that was more a comment, not a question, right? What you said.
No, I mean, it's that kind of format 3.0, I guess is what
What I think what it refers to is that a lot of the data are open. So, for example, you can collect all these tweets and you can do a text analysis on them and do these things. I mean, in this case, this was crowdsourced. We asked people to classify them. And that's true for some of the other sources as well, where you have just a lot more information, who said what, when, and etc. That makes it much easier to detect gaming. And the other aspect is, of course, the relationship. So one very easy metric that we see at PLOS is HTML page views versus PDF downloads. So there's might appear a lot of HTML activity and people spend 10 seconds on it and then go away, and that's very different. And usually that correlates with Facebook and Twitter, but people that download a paper as PDF, that's different then. And that also tells you something about gaming. If there's only one metric goes up, somebody is trying to tamper the system, but if all metrics go up at the same time, you know that's probably real.
Melinda, and then we have two more. Go ahead.
Belinda Kenway from TDI Communications. I'd be interested to
Can you
know-
stand up?
Yes.
So you can-
I'd be interested to know what sort of interest you have from the research community themselves. It sounds fascinating to us as publishers and me as a marketeer, but what sort of uptake do you actually have from authors?
So so for us, so again, I mentioned we're publisher-based, and it's really, you could be doing all metrics for readers or for authors, and it actually turns out all the positive feedback that we get comes from authors. It's invariably, and it's difficult, I can't remember who I was talking about this earlier, but I mean, it's wrong to say it's an ego thing, 'cause it's absolutely not an ego thing. You need to, as a scientist, keep track of this kind of stuff, but it tends to be them that use, the track this by email feature. It's them that are going back to the pages regularly and checking it. And it's definitely them that emails us and says, hey, you're missing this blog, or, you've done this wrong. It's not so much readers, not so much the discovery side. It tends to be the authors that have a
Do
stake.
you have a sense that if that's an enthusiastic minority, or is there something that is going to have more general broader appeal?
No, I think everyone wants to know what people are saying about their work, right? That's a universal thing. I mean, where there's more, I think the metrics part is more contentious. Just saying, like, letting someone know people are talking about your work, everyone likes that. Saying, oh, you're not as good as this other person because, making some sort of value judgment based on that, that's the tricky bit, and that's the bit that people don't want.
Right, so like how many people in this room have Googled their own name, right? Probably everyone has. And I think the reaction to these metrics is often, I want to see myself, right? Show me what I know. And I know we did, not just researchers, but one of the fellows that helped build Plum, he does open source software development. And I needed a quick, just plugged his name in, and immediately I just sent him, hey, this isn't working, kind of being cute, sent him his own profile, like this doesn't work. And I got back to, oh my God, I didn't know people were talking about this on Reddit. Oh, how do I get more detail? And I think that, maybe not that enthusiastic, but there is definitely, we changed the password on our site and we immediately knew that, we should have told people, because the end researchers very quickly had gone back and couldn't get their profiles anymore. It's anecdotal, but it's data.
I'd want to add 2 points, too. It kind of reminds me in some ways, I think there's some difference in the ways that researchers set this based on their status in the world of traditional metrics. I'm kind of reminded of perhaps it's almost certainly a bad metaphor, but the 1918 flu influenza, right? It was remarkable because it attacked people who had stronger immune systems harder than people who had weaker. And I think, interestingly, those scientists who have prospered under the traditional metric system tend to be the ones who both are often not nailing it on the non-traditional metrics, the sort of newer alt metrics, and also they're often not that excited about it because they say, well, this is all nonsense, it's not important. I've only ever made traditional things in my career. I've only ever tried to reach traditional audiences in my career, and by golly, I've done quite well. Anything that makes it look as though I didn't do quite well clearly is wrong. Whereas some of the more up-and-coming people often have more pain about it. They say, well, I build software, I make data sets, surely I can get rewarded for this. Or I reach out to the public, these kind of things. And so there does tend to be some difference. It's certainly not uniform, but I do detect that because I talk to a lot of folks. The other point is that one thing that what no one mentioned earlier is that research administrators and funders are extremely interested in this stuff. We're seeing tremendous interest. Like I said, I just gave a talk, really cool at the NIH to see at that level. I mean, the president, what was it, director of the NIH is there, and he's saying, this stuff is important. We have to find a way to make this case. Mike Stebbins, the OSTP, like all these various people in sort of very high-level federal policy, they feel this pain very intensely. The public says, we keep giving you money to cure cancer, and yet there's still cancer. Surely you're doing something useful out there, right? And so being able to come back and say, well, actually, here's a tweet from someone who is using this in clinical practice, our study, right? That's a very profound thing to say. And one of the stories that came out, and this is high in my way because yesterday, but one of the things that someone mentioned yesterday said, I went to before Congress and I told them all the statistics about all the NIH things that NIH has funded and what a big difference it made and everything. And it was like, yeah, maybe, but surely you could do it for cheaper and everything else. And then I showed him a video of this guy that had Parkinson's, and they put an implant in his brain, and now he's like playing lacrosse with his kids and stuff. And I standing ovation, everyone's crying, and from that point on, I knew I'd won, right? And that's a reality, right? At not just the federal level, but all sorts of possible levels. Certainly for state universities, it's reality. So being able to unearth stories, part of the reason I call it impact stories, it's not just about the numbers. It's about the stories behind those numbers. And we can find those stories without metrics in ways that we never would have been able to before, because the uses people have leave tracks online that didn't used to be there.
All right, this question here, one in the back, one on either side. We'll take them in sequence.
Neil Christensen from Wiley. I'm just curious about the utilization of some of your metrics during your sort of development of your services and products. Are there any metrics that you decided to discontinue because utilization of those particular metrics were low?
Yeah, for us, I can answer that no.
No.
We are really looking at gathering as much as we can, grouping them into categories, and then seeing the uses. It's early, and to say, oh, you know what, that's not worth anything. It may not be worth anything to that set of people, but in another discipline, that may be very valuable. So and we started off with that approach and that kind of model, and that's why we very quickly introduced categories, right? to try to make sense over all these little tiny data points and to pull them together. But there wasn't a way of saying, you know what, that isn't interesting to track because we're only at the beginning. There's hundreds and hundreds of things I wish we already tracked. It's all out there available to be pulled in, and we just have to go and get that data.
And it's not interesting until it's you, right? Like, so there's a paper that came out recently using some of Ewan's data, which was awesome, about how much activity there were on these various sorts of vectors, or these different sorts of altmetrics platforms. And so, for instance, Reddit, which is sort of a social news site, very low. The authors of the paper sort of conclude, well, it's not very useful because there's almost nothing there. Which, from a bibliometric standpoint, right now, that may be true. But if I'm an author and I wrote a paper, and all of a sudden there's a really interesting discussion on Reddit about my paper, either they've misunderstood it and I'd like to correct it, or they really did understand it and I'm really happy and I kind of like to participate in the discussion. For me, then it matters, right? So I think Andrew is exactly right. Now, of course, realistically, we only have a certain amount of developer time, so we do tend to prioritize the sort of more interesting ones and wider use ones. But I agree. I think, for me, a vision in which every single interaction with every single product, where all of that stuff is online, even the very minor ones, to someone that's not minor. And so I think that's really powerful. This is that long tail effect.
I was going to say, just to quickly add to that, maybe so we haven't dropped any sources either for that reason. It's only been when they've been discontinued. But what we have done is certainly have come close to saying maybe we shouldn't try Google+, for example. Not because it's not a great source, but because it's just so difficult to reliably get good data. And if you're going to do so when it's the qualitative stuff, so it's fine for us to show the Google+ thing for an author when they've got it. But if anyone's going to take it, and we're saying, hey, you should take this data and maybe make your own metrics with it. If we're biased somehow to getting great data for 50% of papers and for the other 50%, because of the way the APIs are set up, on the Google side, we're only going to pick up half of the activity, then, do we have the responsibility then to say, actually, we can't do it robustly, so you shouldn't, rely on this for anything. So there is that kind of aspect to it.
So just brief to add my perspective, it's the same. So we have not discontinued something with lack of interest just because the platform disappeared or because there were issues that we maybe changed this, the kind of things we track. And I think one challenge we have is that we tend to sort of track metrics where there is an API or where there are numbers, and this might not be the most interesting thing. So it's much harder to track news, that what Ewan talked about earlier, but these are the interesting things. Another area that's interesting for life sciences Publisher Plus is all the links, for example, to all kinds of scientific data sets and what's happening there. If there's like thousands of gene sequences to link to a paper, that's probably meaningful, and that kind of things that's sometimes more difficult to get. So we're just at the beginning of what you can track.
All right.
Hi, I'm Christy Holmes with Vivo at Washington University, and I'm wondering if the panelists might be able to expand a little bit on some of the nuances of discipline or temporal nature that are involved with monitoring these outputs, and to make it easier to be able to identify meaningful outcomes of research. So obviously, it's very difficult to know when to start an analysis. It's very difficult to know when to end the analysis. So I'm just interested in your, with your different platforms, how you see that, or if it's still early days.
So to clarify, you're asking if we've seen disciplinary differences?
Or how you're thinking about
Okay.
so as you're moving forward with development goals, as you're thinking about analyzing the research, because, you could have something that's like a superstar sort of output leading to a really meaningful outcome in one discipline that would not even register a tick in another. I'm thinking primarily about humanities versus life sciences, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and it's one that the wider bibliometrics community has spent its entire existence grappling with, because there are lots of ways to try and solve it, but none of them are complete, simply because none of us can really reasonably say this discipline ends here and this one starts here, right? I mean, it's fuzzy, and so the answer is always going to have to be fuzzy. One of the things we're excited about doing on an impact story that's in our development roadmap, since you asked, now I get to say the imaginary future that I would love to have happen. But something we're looking at and plan on implementing is being able to normalize by mesh terms. So not even necessarily at the discipline level, but be able to say, for biomed at least, be able to say, I do research into back surgery compared to everyone else who had research into back surgery, has that mesh term. How am I doing? Am I more tweeted than usual? Am I more saved? Am I more cited? Things like that. I think that's at least one, that's one way to sort of break it down. The other, there's certainly a lot of other approaches. You guys may be working on those as well.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, with Plum, we started with a group model, right? Not people, not papers, and being able to compare sets of things to other sets of things. So being able to create those arbitrary sets, whether they are by topic that you can get by, by extracting out, you can get it by groups of people who are affiliated or co-author or other ways, and being able to analyze that grouping that are very much, built for purpose to answer a particular set of questions.
Andrew, can you, so when you're thinking about this, can you actually see how let's call this a discussion, so like tweets or, any of these things, can you see that there are patterns that emerge from the point of the output? So are you tracking, as you're tracking it over time, obviously there's going to be, you hope there's a spike at the beginning, but who knows, the relative story on why things become important as you move.
Right. I know one of the concurrent sessions, there was a tweet that just came out, which I admit I'm tweeting while doing this, about seeing two spikes in usage. One when it's first, you put your preprint out, and then in second when it's actually published. And those two spikes of tweets. So I think it's fascinating. I think that entire measuring of what I've been calling velocity. How much time does it take to get to the first 100 citations? How much time does it take to get to the first citation? How much time, what are all those leading indicators, and how do they interrelate? That's all great questions that, I don't have great data yet, but that's the path of analysis that I think is really fascinating.
Let's say,
We had a question over here and then one over there. Thank you. Can you speak your name and who you're from?
Sure. Jake Wilcock, Capcom Systems. I think everybody on this panel has been perfectly open about the limitations that come with these numbers. I have particular concerns about what are the risks that we face when people do not understand those limitations and think these numbers are finite and final, definite, and complete. How do I communicate on screen where these numbers are displayed to users in a way that they'll actually pay attention to that's short enough? How do I communicate those limitations?
Yes, the question is that the speakers have been honest about the limitations of the systems, and the question that our speaker had was how this panel would advise dealing with those. Every system of metrics has its parameters, its limitations, its strengths, and its weaknesses. So,
I mean, I'd suggest there probably isn't a magic bullet for it. I mean, what I do think is that, we shouldn't necessarily underestimate, what readers and authors or individual researchers will go off and look at. I mean, they won't just take a number at face value. A lot of the time, they are scientists and things. If you think about, I mean, obviously the case where that's happened is the impact factor, where it's kind of become this monster that it wasn't, completely different to what it was meant to be. But that didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like researchers went, oh, there's a number for a journal now, we're going to start using it immediately. That took time. So I think as long as you, take reasonable steps to just make sure users can get to that information fairly easily. They don't have to go off behind a paywall or, go 3 steps down to a website, things like that. I think we're good. I mean, maybe that's optimistic, but...
A slightly different way to answer this would be, it depends on what you use these numbers for. If you say that, I think nobody on the panel said that you want to use a specific number to decide whether or not you hire somebody or give somebody a grant, that would be really, really dangerous. But if you say these numbers are really discovery tools or to give you an overall picture of what's happening, then I think everybody can handle that. So it's really what you put into them, and I think impact assessment is sort of what's looming over this, but I think for these kinds of things, what they mean and how you can standardize and control them, I mean, it's far too early to come up with this for your next hiring decision.
But I think it's entirely laudable that you're asking this question at this point, right? I think, as Ewan mentioned, I think not enough people have been asking that question about things like the impact factor. It's gradually starting to change, but my sense is the danger is sort of not in that direction. I haven't had that many researchers I've talked to say, well, gosh, let's go hire someone based on their tweets. This is a great idea. That's how I want my tenure decided. Thank you. Right? Not many people most people have actually given me sort of the opposite reaction. Well, this couldn't possibly be useful for anything. So in that sense, I think at the stage we are, it's not maybe the problem that I'm most worried about, but at the same time, I think having a disclaimer on your site next to your altmetric.com badge that says, this is only for fun. If you want to do that, I don't think anyone would fault you, right? Like, I mean, or your impacts are same, right? I mean, like, I don't think I don't think there's anything wrong with that. My sense is just that's not necessarily the problem that is most salient at this point.
Okay, so one thing that's interesting here is these answers. A lot of what you're talking about is from an individual level, an individual author, researcher, individual reader, for instance. What about when a funding source comes to me, when a publisher comes to me, and they want high-level metrics across an entire institution, an entire journal, et cetera? Is Altmetrics ready for that stage?
It depends.
So the question is not specifically about individuals, but what about funders? And when they're starting to say that they're going to make decisions based on this data.
Right. One of the Smithsonian uses Plum at an institutional level, and I wouldn't say they're making decisions based on it, but it's giving them data they didn't have any way of answering the question with before. So the phone rang, they get the call saying, Could you please tell me, of the research we funded in the past 12 months, what's been having impact? And with traditional measures, there's no way to answer that question across the whole institution. And so it's kind of the, the visible light spectrum and then the ultraviolet light, right? It was all these things that people couldn't see before that they now can. You have to understand that and put it in context, and the data is sparse in certain areas because that great source hasn't been pulled in yet. But it gives insight at an institutional level that they were blind to before. And as long as there's openness about what you have and what you don't have, which everyone here on the panel tries very hard to do, then I think those questions, there's value in it.
We had one question here and then one over there. Down here? No? All right.
Hi, Andrew from Emerald Group Publishing. Just curious about the value in these metrics. I mean, it all comes down to the data, the quality of the data, whether or not you can get access to the data, the ways that you're representing the data, the way your algorithms work. We've got 4 different kinds of solutions here representing the data. Do we need another product to then aggregate results that you're producing in order to represent? I mean, where does it stop?
Sounds like you could hear that question.
Well, I think it stops when people stop being able to extract value from that chain, right? When they have something that people aren't willing to buy anymore, that's where it stops. And I think we've certainly seen that in the citation realm, right? So in the early days of citation indexing, there was not money to be made off of it, so it didn't exist. So Garfield created the ISI, he was able to make money off it more or less in a monopoly market for quite a long time. As people got more interested in citation mining, as the literature increasingly supported the efficacy of citation mining, he was joined by competitors in the market. And I think it's entirely possible that he will be joined by more competitors in the market. I mean, there's certainly lots of interest from lots of funders right now in funding more open citation databases. I mean, Microsoft is doing terrific things with their Microsoft Academic, who's now gone. But Microsoft Academic Research, he misses my plug. He should have said. Microsoft Academic Research has a more open product. So I think as long as people are able to extract value, there's going to be more competitors in the market. The market sort of will decide which is the most useful approach. I can say that I think one little difference, I think, for Impact Store is that we really do aim, we're quite explicit about we want other people to build on our free metrics and make money off of that. So what we really want to be is something that's, and this is just speaking for myself, but just something that's sort of underlaying that lots of people can build, for instance, the next Google of altmetrics on top of our data. We don't actually want to extract that much value from it. We're going to have some because we need to stay in business, right? But we mostly want to be the platform that lets other people extract lots and lots of value off of it. And I think, personally speaking, that's what I hope the future looks like. But I think there's a lot of other possibilities as well.
We have 2 more questions. I'll start with Adam and then back to you. Adam, can you stand up? And
Adam mentioned Concurrent publishing. I actually have 2 questions. I think they're 2 very different questions. Now, the first one is, in case you shake your head after you said it.
No, it's like if everybody's got 2 questions, we're never going to get out of it.
Have any of you thought about the idea of, so a publisher or journal decides to use any of these services, all of these services, combination, would there be a way to retroactively go back and find links on Twitter, Facebook, things like that, and offer that data? The second question is, tied to what a couple people what we said, you can kind of look at the crystal ball and look into the future where maybe it's possible become an important one-person thing, things of that nature. We all know we live in a world now where $50 you can buy 1,000 Twitter followers or likes and things like that. Have you guys been thinking about, or you already have systems in place to kind of address that, filter that out, make sure that 5 years from now, a story that has 1,000 tweets or whatever, legitimate.
Those are great questions. Can you do the Twitter one? Because Ian's sort of the Twitter expert here.
Yeah, I can. Well, so for the first one, you mean
The first one, yeah.
Okay. In terms of historical data, that's actually a really good question. And the answer is it's very difficult to go back beyond a certain point. I mean, it depends on the source, but effectively all of us are pulling data from APIs, or we're licensing it from databases or whatever, and we have the limitations that those feeds or APIs or databases do. So Twitter, for example, Twitter doesn't keep data from Twitter more than 2 years ago. So even if we wanted it, I think we could go to the Library of Congress and apply for it, and at some point in the next 5 years we'll get a fixed dump. But up until that point, we just can't do anything. So the best we can do is try and collect as much data now going forward as possible, and just make sure that for articles in the future we've got that. And it's the same thing for blogs and newspaper stories and things. Unless we've got access to the archives, we're never going to be able to deliver that to journals.
And a quick plug for what Ewan's doing too is that he's been doing this for a while, and so consequently his collection of, because when did you start, 2010 or something?
Yeah, I think so. We've probably got the most tweets, and we're July 2011 is probably the earliest. Cool. Yeah, so even that's only 2 years. But
it's cool to be doing this, and we're starting to try and do that. I'm sure Andrew's trying to do it now. Is basically, since Twitter's not going to save it, we kind of have to save it on our own, right? And so I think that's kind of cool. And I think Ewan gets great credit for having at least an index that does go back a couple of years that he has, so you don't have to ask Twitter. So I think that's kind of
And there are providers. I mean, there's other Twitter data stream providers that you can license the data from that does go back farther. And some data is mineable. So you may have not, for instance, been tracking your own usage and reporting off of it for a particular publication, but yet you may have log files that you can go back and mine the data from. So it can be expensive to go and get that data, and it's really at what value do you want, how far back do you want to go? So many people when starting say, many publishers say, you know what, I'm not worried about back data right now, let's just start on these journals going forward and look and see how they're doing. And others say, the Smithsonian made the choice, well, we want to go back, forget what it was, 10 years, and at least gather all the research output for the past 10 years, even if the metrics are more sparse about them. So just all these judgment calls about where's the value, how far back do you go, and they're all, some of it's cost, right? How much is the data worth it?
Just to add the PLOS experience, Article Level Metrics project started in 2009, and we went back to include all the user stats since PLOS started in 2003, which I wasn't involved in. That was certainly not fun. Something else to remember is when you look at these metrics over time that the user changes. So it's not so much, maybe even if you had tweets from 2008, the activity there, the number of people using Twitter was just very different, whereas other services were much more in use 2 or 3 years ago than they are now. So some of the bookmarking services or science blogs, for example, I think is maybe there's changes over time, so that makes it also difficult to compare.
Thanks so much. And if I could add one thing to that point, because I think it's a really, really great point, because it's something we don't have to worry about with citations at all. There are disciplinary differences, but we don't believe that there are really strong chronological differences in citation practice. If they are, they're not nearly so pronounced. Whereas, as you say, if you were to track, for instance, Conatia, right? Conatia sort of looked, well, there's not that much interest, got really interested, and then it just went away, right? And so what's interesting about that is, typically for altmetrics, really new things have less numbers because they haven't had enough time to accumulate numbers, right? Same as with citations or anything else. So on the one hand, you have this force that the newer it is, the less activity, less weight it has because it has as much time. But then for altmetrics, you have the opposite direction, which is also the newer it is, the bigger Mendeley is, the bigger some of these other services are. So it actually tends to have more numbers because of that. So you have these two sort of counterbalancing forces. And what becomes then really important, Heather and I did a paper on this, is you essentially have to normalize things based on their time cohort. So you have to say, in 2010, how big a deal was this on these particular services? And that way you manage to both account for the recency advantage and the recency disadvantage at the same time by just comparing with things that were in its time cohort. So that's kind of I think that's one of the sort of, altmetrics as a research field is relatively young, but I think that's sort of one of the interesting things that has been sort of uncovered. Oh, we haven't asked the second question yet.
Can I come back to you?
Judy, we haven't done the second one.
Oh, we haven't done the second
That was
one?
kind of a big one.
All right.
Gaming.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. All right. Question
I've been talking to
number 2.
I can say something about the gaming, which is the thing that we found is, so So we call it gaming when we detect it, and we find it quite easy to detect unusual patterns, because typically it's like, yeah, suddenly a paper has 1,000 tweets, but it's not picked up anywhere else, and then what we have to do is flag it for human creation, and if you look at some of these things, it's obvious that they're being gamed. The problem is actually that deciding whether or not it's, so saying something's gamed, that implies intent. It means the author actually wants to, do something with their metrics. And in a way that's a good problem for us to have, because it means that people care about their metrics. But that's not the kind of thing we see. So, I mean, if you think about a case where maybe someone's put out this is something recently that happened to us. So someone publishes in a medical journal, and they have a particular phrase that they're pushing. They have a particular agenda behind that paper. It's like to cure a particular disease. And they want to get the hashtag trending. So what they do is they go off to one of these marketplaces and they pay for 30,000 people, 30,000 fake accounts to tweet a link to this paper and then the hashtag so that they can try and get it in. So I'm not condoning that. Obviously, that's not a good thing to do. But that's not gaming the metrics. That's the author trying to get attention for their paper. So where do you draw the line? How do you handle that? Should we discard all of those tweets? Should we, keep them visible but not put them in any sort of metrics we produce? And it's kind of like a judgment call there. And I think we'll probably have to, as an industry, decide where, how to make those calls.
So what did you do?
We showed the tweets but didn't include in any sort of metrics in the end.
Just want to quickly give another example where similarly shows the borderline, which is a paper that PLOS published on treatment and there was one person in Canada just retweeting a lot, basically alerting I think, parliamentary commission whether or not to pay for this treatment. So this activism and sort of a sign of impact. This is really going into somebody wants to make a difference there, and these were also different tweets to different people in the parliament, or is this gaming? And we decided, if we're in doubt, we just leave it as it is and don't call it gaming and count these numbers. But there are many, many edge cases, but it's clear that this is on all our agendas, that this will become more important, and we all need strong technical infrastructure to handle that.
All right, so we get two. Okay. One last question then.
I just wanted to follow on from the earlier question about researcher assessment. It seems to me this is a new sort of story, and there's a lot of opportunity for we as the industry to get out ahead of the game. I think it's laudable that you all said that the limitations of these things should be used for a portion of their use by funders in research assessment. Now, there's a kind of cautionary tale here that when Eugene Garfield invented the impact factor, he never meant for it to be used by funders to assess researchers. But guess what they did? They went and used it because it was there and it was a metric. And so I just wonder if you think there's anything that we can do as an industry to caution about misuse of these in advance, so that in 5 years' time there's not another door of petition, and this time it's against all metrics.
I completely agree, and we have internally discussed how to sort of send the message and to talk to other people, which basically said, like all other numbers, this has always been taken in context and you need sensible judgment with these numbers, which is both for impact assessment but also to just understand these numbers. So there's always, you never have a machine telling you what something is. You always need on top of that personal judgment and a reasonable thinking of what these numbers mean. And that's, I mean, it's sort of a given statement, but it has to be made that it's really important here. And I think that there's no disagreement in people doing these things.
Yeah, I mean, we've resisted the urge to give a single number, right? That's one of the ways that we've not gone, tried to not go down that road. So we summarize things, but we don't say, oh, this is a 42. And I know Altmetric does give a single number, and people love it, right? Mm-hmm. They get lots of, right, because it's simple. And there's a balance, and not saying that we'll never do it, but it's something we've been very cautious about doing, to try to, how do you give the context and try to put things in context? And it's something that I think from all of our perspectives, we're trying to do. And I know Ewan does a great job of, giving, this is the data behind that number as well, and trying to make it out there. But when it's, it's hard to do it well, that it won't get misused, and there's no way to really prevent that.
I think it's impossible. I mean, it's an important question, because I think ultimately, I do think it's impossible to keep this from happening, because there's an arms race, right? Same was true in the case of the impact factor. Almost everybody in this room would say impact factors have not been particularly good as a way of assessing scholarly publishing, and yet almost all of the publishers in this room, I would imagine, probably, if their impact factor is reasonably good, they're quick to tell people, because that's what folks want to know. And the last thing you want to do is say, well, we think impact factor is worthless and we won't tell you ours. Everyone's just going to say, well, it's because it's crummy, right? Like, no one wants to, right? PLOS, I think, admirably has not done that. And despite having +1, having a terrific impact factor, they've not trumpeted, which I think is very rare. And it's very difficult to do, and maybe PLOS has sort of systematic reasons why they can get away with that. But I think the same may be true for altmetrics as well, right? No matter how well-intentioned we are and how much we want to learn from past mistakes, people with really good numbers are going to say, my number is really good, and then the other people are going to be sort of forced to say, well, why aren't you telling us ours? So I think what Andrea mentioned about openness and making what is behind the data available, I think is, at least in some ways, since it's going to happen anyway, we can sort of ameliorate the effects by saying, if you do give us a one magic number, I need to see every single number behind that, every single calculation behind that, before I'm going to trust it all. And that, I think, is something we reasonably could do, especially as the sort of cultural climate moves towards openness today. I think we can maybe start to insist on that. The impact factor doesn't do that, right? And so I think that might be, at least in some ways, maybe an anodyne for that pain.
All right. Well, I'd like to close by thanking you for a wonderful discussion, and I'd like to close by thanking our panel, who told me that they have not all been in the same room together on for a presentation. So, made for a very well-rounded discussion.